Jenny just told me I'm having way too much fun here, but how can I help that? This is a special moment in so many ways, and it's great that the Department of Acoustics has made this keynote possible. Every now and then you have these moments of synchronicity. I was talking to Vic Sparrow. Is Vic here? Yeah, hey. So you remember this? We were talking about the conference, and you said, we'd like to support another keynote. And I said, that'd be great. And you said, do you know who Carla Scaletti is? And I said, do I know who Carla Scaletti is? Everybody in the field of computer music knows who Carla Scaletti is. Carla Scaletti invented the Kima software and the hardware system. Carla Scaletti was at the first ICAD 25 years ago. Carla Scaletti gave us the first definition of sonification. Carla Scaletti was the external reader for my thesis on sonification back in 2000. Carla Scaletti gave the keynote at the Computer Music Conference in 2015, and it was a bang-up job. I was there taking notes the whole time so I could put these little nuggets in my book. Yes, Vic, I know who Carla Scaletti is. Let me contact her. And I did, and she responded right away, and she's been absolutely terrific to work with. So 25 years of reflection on the field. Carla Scaletti is going to come in here and offer us her words of wisdom. I don't know if she's tongue-in-cheek. I don't know if she's serious. Only she knows that. So I'm just tickled pink to present to you Carla Scaletti.
Thank you, Mark Ballora, and thanks, Vic Sparrow, and thanks to the graduate program in acoustics at Penn State for inviting me here to reflect on the 25th anniversary of ICAD. So, full disclosure, I do not think that sonification is a joke. In fact, far from it. In fact, I think that sonification is the third leg of human auditory communication, equal in importance to the other ways we have of conveying meaning through sound, speech, and music. Before I added the word sonification to my laptop dictionary, I was starting to get really annoyed because it kept, autocorrect kept changing it to signification. But then I decided to look up what signification means, and I thought, oh, maybe autocorrect's trying to tell me something. Because sonification actually is an auditory signal that conveys meaning. There's a common misconception that words and words alone can convey meaning. When Steven Pinker writes, even a plot as simple as boy meets girl, boy loses girl cannot be narrated by a sequence of tones, he seems to imply that the only meaningful information is that which can be encoded as the sequences of symbolic phonemes we call speech. But we all know from our everyday experience with graphs that there are also other non-symbolic ways to convey meaning. For example, if we were to take periodic measurements of air pressure at a single point in space and then map those values to the vertical dimension of a 2D graph where the horizontal direction was time, we might end up with a representation of an air pressure wave that looks like this. This is a cross-domain mapping, because we have invisible air pressure over here and a vertical dimension of an image over here. And what makes it meaningful is the fact that, to some extent, it's an inference-preserving map. In other words, the reasoning that we do and observations we make with the map also hold true in the original source. Computer scientist Joseph Goguen calls this kind of a map a semiotic morphism. Mapping from one system to another is what Goguen calls design, and its inverse inferring properties of the source from properties in the target, is what he calls understanding. Gauguin defines the quality of the mapping as the extent to which it preserves the most important aspects of the original structure. In fact, the whole premise of data visualization and sonification is that it's possible to map from a source domain to a target domain in such a way that inferences you draw in the target domain will also hold true in the source domain. That it's possible to map not just individual points, but relations among points from the source to a target domain. We've been using the word map in the mathematical sense of a function or morphism, but cartographic maps are also maps. Forget the 2D map of the world that you may have had on your elementary school classroom wall. The 21st century map is, according to Bruno Latour, is an interface that allows us to navigate through heterogeneous data sets that are continually refreshed, localized, and refined by our queries, just like sonification. What do we want from a cartographic map? We're not really looking for a painting or a 2D image of the landscape. What we really want is a way to get from here to there. So what we really want is relevant relationships and connections and structures that might facilitate or impede our progress. Likewise, what we want from a data sonification is not entertainment or an acoustical simulacrum of the real world. We're listening for relevant relationships, connections, structures, and patterns. And in a well-designed, inference-preserving sonification, those relationships are also present in the original source of the data. We talk a lot about data, but it's actually not the data that we care about. The data are just a trace left by some dynamic process that we're trying to understand. The process of gathering or generating data is itself a mapping. Each step along the way involves decisions and choices as to which aspects of the dynamic process you're measuring, at what time intervals, and with what resolution. And in the end, the map is not the territory. The data are not the dynamic process. Or to quote from Lao Tzu, nature can never be completely described, for such a description of nature would have to duplicate nature. Since we can't map everything, someone's decision on what was important to measure and how to make the measurement, in combination with decisions on how to map the measurements to visual or auditory parameters, has a huge influence on what people will be able to hear and see in the data, and consequently in how they're likely to think about the underlying dynamic process. Or as geographers John Krieger and Dennis Wood put it, a map is a proposition. It reflects a worldview of the map makers, showing you what they think is important. I would take it a step further and say that every data set is also a proposition. It reflects someone's assessment of what was important to measure and which relationships in the original process were the important ones to preserve in those measurements. It's not that visual mapping is in some way more objective or rational than an auditory mapping. Every mapping reflects a long chain of decisions and choices and assumptions and attitudes, which is why it's hardly ever enough to create just one mapping based on one set of data or even just from one researcher. Different data and different mappings reveal different aspects of the original model. If you want to see precise values to several significant digits, it may be that the best mapping is to a list of numbers. But if you want a sense for the relationships among those values, you probably want to use a visualization or sonification. And if you want to reveal the dynamics on how those numbers and values and relations change over time, for that you probably need sonification or an animation. That's part of what Alan Craig and I were trying to get across in 1991 with our project using sound to extract meaning from complex data. We took the same data, the same model world, and mapped it to both animation and sound. The idea was that the sonification could give researchers another perspective on the same world, another way to conceptualize the same invisible process, and giving a more complete sense of that process. And no surprise, we discovered that not only did the sonifications enhance the visualizations, but the sound mappings were actually more effective at revealing certain aspects of the original models. Bruno Latour argues that one reason the sciences are often able to produce objective knowledge is precisely because a scientific argument is never an isolated mapping between a model and a single representation. There are always multiple mappings generated by instruments, theories, calculations, along with multiple correspondences between each map and its antecedents and consequence in this series of arguments that we call a scientific article. Latour points out that a scientific visualization, and by extension sonification, is only scientifically meaningful when it's presented in the context of other mappings. Text, equations, tables, graphs, charts, captions, as citations of previous work. What Latour calls a cascade of inscriptions. Each of these elements is one step in a chain of reasoning that leads to the conclusion. So you can't remove an element without disrupting the argument. And any single element taken out of its context loses much of its scientific meaning. These multiple interdependent inscriptions, along with the process of peer review and the historical reputation of the publisher, can combine to give a stamp of legitimacy to a new piece of knowledge published as an article in a scientific journal. So I think that for this audience, it would be like preaching to the choir to say that sonification, this concept of a cross-domain, inference-preserving auditory mapping used as part of a cascade of scientific inscriptions, is a seriously powerful tool for discovering, understanding, and conveying knowledge through sound. That's why I was kind of baffled as to why sonification was the target of CERN's annual April Fool's prank last year.
Scientists at the LHC have been transforming data from the smallest particles into sound. They have made a sensational discovery, giving new insights into the fabric of space and time. They compared the sound of background events with those from the Higgs boson. And, as they obtained more and more data, it became clear that the Higgs boson sonification contains Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Pythagoras saw a deep connection between the spheres of planets and harmony in music.
This is an amazing discovery. I'm very happy to see this deep connection between music and physics. Maybe this is the way to finally study the tiny vibrations that could allow us to study string theory at the LHC.
So first off, congratulations. Researchers at the world's largest particle physics laboratory are familiar enough with the word sonification and think the public is familiar with the word enough that they could make an insider joke based on it. And second off, really? No, really, guys, why why is sonification a joke? And why does the video include multiple examples of data visualization that seem to just pass by without a comment or a hint of a smile, whereas this idea of data sonification is a subject of great hilarity, or at least some smirking? Or to paraphrase some of the central questions posed by Karin Bijsterveld's Sonic Skills research project, why, in the face of evidence that scientists have for years used their ears in making sense of what they study, and that these listening practices have resulted in new scientific knowledge, why is it that the scientific legitimacy of listening remains contested, or in this case, laughable? Part of the issue in this particular case may be just that the researchers don't know about the third way of making meaning with sound. They hear about something called sonification, and they know it's not words, so they assume it must be music. This is borne out by the text that accompanies the video, in which they refer to sonification as music, language, a film score, a random tune, or recognizable notes. And as an aside, did anyone else find it ironic that the music they discover in their data was more contemporaneous with classical Newtonian physics? Well, okay, you're probably saying this is just a joke. But sometimes I think when someone tells you a joke, it reveals something about the way they really think. I think one of the reasons that Mark invited me here to talk this year was because I was one of the invited speakers at the first ICAD in 1992. And he thought it might be interesting to reflect on the 25th anniversary of ICAD. One of the things that hasn't changed much over the past 25 years is the fascination that the public has for the idea of sonification. Out of curiosity, I did an informal Google search for news stories mentioning the word sonification. And I limited it to just 1 month, May of 2017. And the search turned up 7 individual projects, 7 stories about projects. All of them were fairly breathless with excitement about how this novel technique might transform the future of data. It's encouraging that there's so much public fascination with the idea of sonification. But at the same time, it's kind of frustrating that 25 years after the first ICAD, sonification is still considered a curiosity or a novelty or an emerging field that might be transformative in the future, instead of the widely accepted tool that we all thought it would be by now. It's like sonification is the hot new thing, and it's been the hot new thing for 50 years. So why is it still considered a novelty? Alexandra Zupper has been studying the ICAD community for several years as part of her dissertation on scientific data sonification, titled Lobbying for the Ear, the Public Fascination with and Academic Legitimacy of the Sonification of Scientific Data. She describes the ICAD community as lobbying for the ear, for listening, as a legitimate sensory pathway for acquiring new scientific knowledge, just as legitimate as the eye. At the same time, she observes that ICAD is an interdisciplinary community engaged in an ongoing struggle for the scientific acceptance of sonification. Quoting one scientist who has worked with data sonification as admitting, "It's not something I want to be making a big fuss about because I want people to take me seriously as a physicist." And I suspect we all have personal anecdotes about researchers we know who were reluctant to present sonification results at a domain-specific conference for fear of being labeled as eccentrics. Zupper tries to analyze why it is that the public has a fascination with sonification and why this isn't translated into a wider acceptance as a legitimate tool by domain scientists. Zupper's hypothesis for the public fascination with sonification is something she calls the expectation of the auditory sublime. A sense of promise that, through sound, a member of the general public might be able to have an effortless personal experience of the awe and wonder of science, without having to invest any time in learning the underlying concepts behind the science, or having to struggle with mastering any new ideas or new ways of thinking. This expectation is shared by some researchers who think that sonification might be a way to, quote, share the love without sharing the pain, or to make the excitement of the work palpable without having to simultaneously engage in the hard work and incomprehensible details of the calculations. And that's a good thing, right? Maybe, because Zupper is cautioning that the strategies that are successful in establishing public interest in sonification do not automatically lead to its increased scientific acceptance. Many of the same researchers who embrace sonification as a means for popularizing their work insist they would never use sonification in their research, reinforcing a kind of a categorical distinction between real and popular science, and implying that sound is only appropriate for popular science. In a 2013 article published in the Social Studies of Science, Zupper notes that although it's become fairly common for astroseismologists to use sonification in public lectures, they rarely play those sounds for an audience of specialist peers. And if they are played for a scientific audience, they're usually framed as amusements. An astroseismology textbook published in 2010 even warns, while it is possible to use our observations of pulsating stars to generate sound files for the stars and listen to them, we do not do science that way. This style of public outreach often seems intended to function more as PR or kind of a self-promotion than genuine attempt to actually educate the public. Zupper interviewed some researchers who even felt annoyed when people started to ask too many questions about how the sounds were mapped. The researcher didn't know and didn't feel a need to know how the sound was made. Another researcher who did create his own sound mappings freely admitted to massaging the data to make his examples sound more musical. I was wondering if he also massages the data to make his graphs look nicer for scientific publications. Or maybe he's just saying that he considers sonification to be an entertaining way to promote his work to the public rather than a serious tool for research. So maybe there needs to be a special name for this particular application of data mapping to sound, so we can distinguish it from serious sonification. Maybe we can call it self-promotification. In her analysis of the public discourse on sonification, Zupper noticed that for some reason, sound is believed to be an immersive and emotional medium, in contrast to the supposedly more detached sense of vision. That it holds the promise of creating sublime experiences of science, experiences of awe and wonder, often tinged with an element of terror. And that the experience of the auditory sublime is emotionally loaded and visceral, perhaps even mystical and spiritual, and certainly awe-inspiring and enthralling. Which made me wonder, is the auditory sublime just another word for music? It seems to describe the popular experience of music, which is not necessarily through attentive or analytical listening, but more as a visceral, emotional, mystical, or spiritual, awe-inducing, enthralling experience. Letting the sound wash over you at an unconscious level, rather than listening attentively and trying to get important information. So maybe the real issue for both sonification and for music is not that hearing is about affect and vision is about intellect, but that while our educational system has trained us to look carefully and analytically at graphs and diagrams and maps, it hasn't trained us to listen analytically. We were probably told, listen while the teacher's talking, but most people haven't been trained to derive vital or practical information by listening attentively to other kinds of complex auditory signals. Unless you were really lucky, like most of us were in this room, because I'm guessing we wouldn't even be here if we didn't already know that non-speech audio signals can convey information. So the solution may be to put more emphasis on the ear in learning, which also happens to be the theme of this year's ICAD, sound in learning. Both in the sense of using sound to facilitate learning and in learning how to listen to sound in an attentive way, learning how to extract useful information from audio signals. Last year, Anna Harris and Eleanor Flynn did a study where they interviewed medical students and their professors to ask about their experience of learning to use a stethoscope in cardiovascular and respiratory exams. Many of the students reported that it was a difficult and intimidating skill to learn, but it turned out not everyone found the process difficult. It turned out that medical students who had studied music found it easier to identify the sounds and describe the sounds associated with certain conditions. As one student put it, at the start you can't really hear anything. I didn't know what I was hearing or what I was supposed to be listening for. But as one of the teachers points out, it's a matter of practice. The more you hear, the more you hear. The professors try to get the students to use what they call active listening. I tell them that listening to murmurs is different to any other listening you've done. It's not like putting the stethoscope in your ears and letting the sounds wash over you. You need to concentrate. You need to focus on frequency, on intensity. The sounds might be quieter than you think. You need to listen actively. The authors conclude that training the senses through attentiveness is a critical aspect of a doctor's education and one that should be better addressed in medical school because it would improve a doctor's diagnostic skills. They suggest medical students should get some classical music training. But I think that attentive listening abilities are more probably a side effect of music training. And there are many, many ways that we could train people in attentive listening. Maybe through sound-based puzzles and games, simple sound graphing, perhaps even field recording and analytical listening to sound walks. Or learning how to add scripted sound to a computer game such that it conveys information about the state of the game. The important thing is to create an expectation that you can derive information from the sound rather than just letting sound wash over you, whether in the hopes of experiencing the auditory sublime or, sadly, more likely, just letting it go into the background. We probably all agree that it would be great to introduce sonification and attentive listening in the public schools. But when I did a search for curriculum standards in public education, only 2 subjects come up: language and mathematics. If we could demonstrate that attentive listening and sonification training also lead to measurable improvements in students' language and mathematical skills, maybe that would be a way to convince the general public that these sonic skills are useful enough to be included in public education. Public school education focuses on language arts training, but all 3 legs of the human meaning-making with sound require learning and practice. From the moment we're born, we start learning the phonemes of our mother tongue, and K-12 education puts a heavy emphasis on language arts. Music making requires learning and practice too. Most often, though, that's acquired outside the public school. And sonification too requires learning and practice, both in learning how to create these cross-domain inference-preserving mappings and in learning to listen, remember, and extract meaning from the auditory signals. But the good news is, it appears that learning and practice in one leg of the triad can also improve your performance and abilities in another. Nina Krause's lab at Northwestern, for example, has demonstrated that musical training can help remediate some language disorders. So when it comes to convincing people that sonification and attentive listening training have a place in the K-12 curriculum, maybe we can change people's minds by showing them that sound changes minds in a literal sense. Or more specifically, that your experience with sound over a lifetime leaves an imprint in the way your brainstem responds to complex auditory signals. At Nina Krause's auditory neuroscience lab, they use something called the CABR, complex auditory brainstem response, as an objective, non-invasive way to study how the brain processes complex sounds like speech and music. They put electrodes on your scalp, and then they play you a sound, and then they measure the brainstem's evoked response to that sound. The amazing thing is that the brain's response signal resembles the original audio signal. The timing in the spectrum of the evoked signal in the brain is really similar to the timing in the spectrum of the original. So they can use like cross correlations and other kinds of signal processing to compare the original signal with the evoked response from the brain. And they use that CABR to detect differences in the way different individuals process auditory signals. What they found is that the CABR reflects an individual's past experience with sound. Experience can selectively enhance relevant components and attenuate irrelevant inputs. So it's not just an individual's accumulated exposure to sound, but it really reflects what that individual finds relevant and what they focus on, leaving a kind of a neural signature that's recognizable. So what she found was that anything from short-term training to lifelong experience with sound shows up as a characteristic signature in the CABR. And Krause says she can immediately tell whether someone has had any musical training by recognizing what she calls a characteristic musician's signature in the CABR. The so-called musician's signature is characterized by enhancements in the ability to parse an auditory scene, the degree of precision in the neural representation of fine timing, enhanced working memory and attention, improvements in the nervous system's ability to do statistical prediction, to detect hidden patterns and relationships and predict what's going to happen next, and an improved ability to understand speech in a noisy background. Past experience with sound can shape automatic sound processing even many years later. Just a few years of music training in childhood influences neural encoding of sound in adulthood, years after the training is stopped. After only 2 years of music training, elementary school children show greater neural differentiation of contrastive consonants, and musicians show more neural differentiation of consonant sounds across their lifespan. In a recent blog that she wrote for Scientific American, Krause writes, "In my laboratory, when I see a computer screen displaying someone's brainwave, I can usually guess whether they are a musician or not based on the rich, clean quality of the musician's brain signature. At the other end of the spectrum, my lab works with children who grow up in noisy environments and receive little linguistic enrichment. And sadly, I can spot that signature too. Yes, sound, for better or worse, is that powerful." She then adds something kind of scary, which is, The absence of meaningful sound also leaves a mark on the brain's ability to process sound, which is pretty alarming considering the amount of noise and meaningless sound that we subject ourselves to on a day-to-day basis. Krauss offers a couple of suggestions on how to protect yourself against meaninglessness. Either learn another language or learn to play an instrument. So I was trying to think, what would learning another language and learning to play a musical instrument have in common? They both involved listening carefully to complex audio signals and extracting information that's relevant. And to some extent, they both involve using your body, whether it's your vocal apparatus or your fine motor skills over a musical instrument, to generate audio signals. So it may be that actually the generating is an essential part of that neural signature. So maybe we should add learn data sonification to the list of ways that we could defend ourselves against meaninglessness. Because sonification too involves attentive listening to audio signals. It motivates you to focus on an audio signal in order to extract information relevant to your work. And if we include what Alexandra Zupper calls data karaoke skills, being able to generate approximate sound indexes with your own voice, like it goes like this, woo. Then it would also include using your body to generate meaningful sound morphisms. When you think about it in those terms, that lack of attention to sound can actually diminish the brain's ability to perceive and interpret complex sounds. It actually becomes rather urgent that we start teaching attentive listening in the schools. So we may have the argument we were looking for, because Krauss's research suggests that training in one kind of complex auditory signal processing, music, can translate to improved skills in another kind of complex auditory signal processing, language. Researchers from her lab have even done music-based interventions in the Chicago public schools and have shown that they're able to improve the skills of children with language disorders. We could argue that for all the same reasons, learning attentive listening and data sonification in school might help enhance kids' language and reading ability. Now, what about the more obvious application of data sonification in learning mathematics? Data representation and interpretation are already a central part of the public school mathematics curriculum, starting as early as kindergarten. And at every step, there are some kind of obvious places where developing sonification skills alongside the traditional graphing and charting skills could be inserted. For example, in the Illinois Common Core State Standards for Mathematics, each kindergarten student is expected to learn to describe and compare measurable attributes, classify objects, and count the number of objects in each category. By first grade, they generate data sets by using rulers to measure things, and then they learn to organize, represent, and interpret data in up to 3 categories. By second grade, they're drawing bar graphs and number lines, and by third grade, they're expected to be able to, quote, show the data by making a line plot. When I saw just how early we get introduced to the concepts of visual data mapping, it made me realize something. It's not that visual mappings are innate or universal. It's just that we learn the conventions of visual graphs at such a young age that we no longer remember having to figure it out the first time. Have you ever had that experience where you struggle to learn something, and then once you finally get it, it feels like you always knew it? And if after enough time goes by, it even starts to feel natural or even intuitive. It seems like line graphs and bar charts have been around forever, but apparently they were invented in 1786 by a Scottish engineer named William Playfair, who later went on to invent the pie chart in 1801. In his brief history of data visualization, Michael Friendly describes how Playfair's first line graph was accompanied by several pages of text explaining how to read and understand it. In other words, graphs didn't come naturally to people then or now. They're just visual conventions that you and I had to learn and internalize by the time we were in 3rd grade. So and as a society, we've had over 200 years to get used to interpreting line graphs. So it's okay if sonifications aren't immediately understood by untrained listeners. And it seems reasonable to adopt some standard conventions and devote a little time to training people on how to listen to them and extract information from them. In his statement of the conference theme, Mark Ballora points out that scientific literacy is typically gained through the study of graphs and reliance on visual conventions that have been in use since the late 18th century and have become part of the standard research vocabulary. When a set of conventions has been in use for over 200 years and is part of the standard vocabulary for both research and education, it means that our reliance on those visual conventions and belief in their legitimacy is pretty firmly entrenched. Convincing people that those conventions could be enhanced by sonification is going to require a pretty significant alteration in the institutions, behaviors, values, and norms of science. In other words, it may require a social change before sonification too becomes part of the standard research vocabulary. Luckily, there's an app for that, or at least a Harvard Business School model for that. Clayton Christensen is the Harvard business professor who came up with this theory of disruptive innovation. But he's also written about a related model that he calls a catalytic innovation. It's basically a disruptive innovation that results in social change instead of a new commercial product. Like disruptive business innovations, catalytic innovations start out by providing solutions for ignored or underserved populations. Solutions that turn out to be so useful that eventually everyone wants them. At some point, the new solution becomes universally adopted and changes the status quo. So, could it be that the use of sound in STEM education for visually impaired students is the catalytic innovation that will eventually result in the ubiquitous use of sonification for all students? And that once enough e-textbooks, graphing tools, and other educational materials have a button for visually impaired students to be able to switch on the sound, that other students will also try switching on the sound on button. And at that point, it's kind of up to us. If the students find the sonifications useful, if they discover that the sound enhances their understanding, they're going to leave the sound switched on. And the status quo for STEM education will be permanently altered. The good news is that the catalysis has already begun. There are several groups using data sonification for visually impaired students. To name just a few recent examples, Jamie Ferguson is doing his PhD at the University of Glasgow on Bell 3D, an audio-based astronomy education system for visually impaired students. Sergio Machetti's group at the University of Milan and Everywhere Technologies is evaluating sonification techniques to support individuals with visual impairment in recognizing shapes on touchscreen devices. Bruce Walker's Sonification Lab at Georgia Tech is partnering with Kenyatta University and a nonprofit called Enable to deploy and evaluate assistive technologies in Kenya for STEM students with vision loss. Orly Lahav's group at Tel Aviv University is evaluating the effectiveness of their L2C software for sonifying complex dynamical systems in order to give blind students access to the content of the science curriculum. And Jamie Ferguson is already thinking ahead to the transition to universal adoption, writing that the goal of his Bell 3D software is communicating astronomy to visually impaired students, as well as providing a new modality of astronomy experience for those who are sighted. A common thread running through much of this work is the unassailable argument that the overwhelming reliance of STEM education on the visual presentation of data makes this kind of learning less accessible for visually impaired students. Or as Bruce Walker writes, every day we need to understand data in order to make choices in our lives. For people with vision loss, the typical graphical presentations of data may be difficult or impossible to access. As a result, education and employment are difficult for blind individuals, especially in STEM fields. And in reality, we are all sensory impaired. As astrophysicist Wanda Diaz-Merced reminds us, humans are blind to much of the light that comes from the universe. From infrared to ultraviolet, sighted eyes are sensitive to only a narrow band of light located almost in the middle of that spectrum. Speaking about students with vision loss in a recent interview, she said, "They run into roadblocks constantly and they think this is normal. But it shouldn't be normal for any scientist of any ability to have only limited access to data." And by the way, she also says it takes training to use sonic data. Merced said she trains students by hiding information in manipulated data and turning it into a game. So actually, it's not that much of a leap from adaptive technology to universally adopted technology. We use sonification, visualization, and mathematical modeling precisely because we're blind and deaf to most of the dynamic processes we want to understand. We can't directly see protons colliding with each other or hear the dynamics of signaling proteins within a living cell, but we can map those dynamical processes to the kinds of signals that we can perceive. It's this ability of humans to form analogies and reason with them that makes it possible for us to collectively extend our knowledge beyond the range of our sense organs. It's almost a cliche or a truism that someone with vision loss will adapt or compensate by developing a more acute sense of hearing. And in a way, that's what sonification is. It's us using technology to give ourselves a more acute or wider range of hearing, enabling us to adapt or compensate for our sensory limitations, making the invisible audible. The public schools may be the official institutions of learning, but we all know that learning happens everywhere. And individuals from the ICAD community are lobbying for active listening and sonification via these unofficial educational channels too. Jamie Ferguson, for example, is developing a planetarium presentation of his 3D sonic star maps. Bruce Walker's lab at Georgia Tech works with a local aquarium. Mark Blora has an installation here on campus in the Penn State Earth and Mineral Science Museum that not only presents sonifications of storm data, but also allows visitors to learn how those data were mapped to sound. One could argue that sonification would make all those visual displays of data in museums and public libraries accessible to all patrons, not just those with 20/20 vision. And these could be examples of using sound to convey actual information and content, and not just as a feel-good, ain't science awesome experience. Another way to change hearts and minds is through radio, TV, film, and games. If you know a game developer or a screenwriter, why not lobby for more storylines where a character manages to solve a mystery through active listening or through data sonification? We also learn through the ordinary media, those always-on technologies that suffuse and saturate our daily lives, like Google search and social media and Wikipedia. That's why I'm excited about the 2017 Do-A-Thon initiative to create sonifications for Wikipedia. Ensuring that every graph or chart in Wikipedia also has a parallel sonification could normalize the concept of abstract sound graphs in the minds of the general public and specialist researchers alike. Not only that, but it makes the content in Wikipedia accessible and open to all users, not just the cited ones. Wikipedia itself is an example of a catalytic innovation. And Wikipedia, enhanced by data sonification, could be another path to universal adoption of sonification as a legitimate educational and research tool. Whatever conventions are adopted by the Wikipedia sonifications are likely to become standards, or at least establish an initial set of conventions that would let us share sound map data the same way that cartographers shared spatial and navigational data in the so-called age of exploration and discovery. Around in the time of the Middle Ages, it started to become common practice for ship captains to log and survey and bring back spatial data on every voyage, no matter what the reason for the voyage. Standardizing on a set of conventions for mapping all that spatial data made it possible for anyone to read a map and use it for navigation, no matter what the original source of the data. It made it possible to navigate through a territory where you'd never been before. Kind of like Google Maps is making it possible for all of us to find our way around Happy Valley this week. Converging on this set of mapping conventions resulted in an explosion of navigation and exploration in the 16th century. And so it's possible that converging on a set of standards and conventions for sonification could trigger our own age of exploration and discovery through sound. Another part of the Do-A-Thon this year includes adding sound to web documents, like Jupyter notebooks, which can include live code, equations, visualizations, text, and now sonifications. It's like a live interactive version of Bruno Latour's cascade of inscriptions. If the web document is tutorial in nature, it could serve as a demonstration of the power of sound in learning. And for the publishers of traditional science journals, it serves as an example of how an online journal could use inline sonifications and animations and interactive models as part of a scientific argument. The ultimate stamp of scientific legitimacy is probably still having an article published in a respected journal. Yet, despite the fact that most journals are now published online or have an online edition, and therefore could include sound directly in line with the text, most of them seem to isolate sounds and videos in a supplementary materials section, instead of inlining them as part of Latour's cascade of inscriptions. I think the reason Latour calls graphs and equations and inscriptions is to emphasize that they too are forms of writing, like text, because he knows that being an author conveys authority and legitimacy. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that one can author a graph, a piece of software, and a sonification, just as one can author a written text. When sonifications are included in line as one more logical step in a multi-step scientific argument, they'll acquire a greater level of scientific meaning and legitimacy, on a par with that of the surrounding text, tables, equations, and graphs. In a web publication, you actually can inline sonifications and animations, and as the Jupyter notebooks make clear, you can do more than that. You can also make the steps of the argument interactive. Alan McGeechan is a professor of geography and director of the GeoVista Center here at Penn State. He's interested in visual analytics, the science of analytical reasoning facilitated by interactive visual interfaces. In particular, what he calls information foraging and sense-making with heterogeneous data. Professor McGeechan came up with something he calls the cartography cube, and I've redrawn a blue version of it here, and I called it the sonification cube. It's an analytical reasoning space defined by the dimensions private to public, vertical, known to unknown, left to right, and the degree of interactivity from high to low on the z-axis. So, for example, a researcher might start out in the lower right front corner of the cube, working alone and interactively exploring, trying out lots of variations in order to reveal unknowns. Basically, using sonification to forage in an unknown territory for understanding and information. If at some point the researcher discovers something, some new information, or just gains some additional insight, that finding might be published in an online journal, becoming more public and less interactive. At that point, the researcher is moved to the upper left back corner of the cube, using sound to communicate a known piece of information to a wider public. But at some point, online journals and web publications could even let us operate kind of in the middle of that cube by letting the readers of a scientific article have access to the data and interactively trying out their own mappings. In 1992, it was kind of a big deal for Addison Wesley to include an audio CD with the proceedings of the first ICAD. But in practice, having to take the CD out of its sleeve and put it in a computer that doesn't have a CD slot anymore, and cue it up to match where you're reading is really, really awkward. It's not like having the sonic inscription just in line with the text, exactly where it should be, as part of this argument supported by the equations and the graphs. I remember a particular day in 1993, the year after the first ICAD. My friend Dan Brady came up to me and said, "Hey, you should come over and see this thing that Mark Andreessen's working on. It's this kind of a multimedia hypertext way of accessing the thing that Tim Berners-Lee has at CERN." So it turned out that Dan was describing Mosaic, or Netscape as it was later known, the first web browser. So it's kind of hard to even picture that now, but in 1992, at the time of the first ICAD, we didn't yet have a way to browse the web, let alone play sounds in a web browser. It wasn't until 1996 that we could use Google to search the web, and 5 years after that, that we could look things up in Wikipedia. And it's only been within the last 5 years that a Kickstarter campaign for Oculus Rift started to make the idea of interactive virtual environments seem attainable to more than just a handful of research centers. So many pieces are in place now. And all of these things are about to come together. It's an amazing moment for sonification. For 25 years, the ICAD community has been successfully lobbying for the ear, advocating for the auditory as a legitimate pathway for the acquisition of knowledge. Now, due to the convergence of the technological infrastructure, like the web and e-publishing, and the catalytic innovation of sonification in STEM education, and the persistent, unrelenting advocacy on the part of the ICAD community, sonification is just on the verge of taking off and taking hold in a more widespread, scientifically legitimate and permanent way. It's also a somewhat treacherous moment for sonification. It's like we're at an unstable fixed point, where the slightest breath could nudge us one way or another. Are we going to tip forward toward overwhelming ubiquity and widespread legitimacy, or will we be stuck forever in the well of fascinating novelty as the promising new thing for the next 25 years? I think with a few well-placed nudges, we can tip things in the direction of scientific legitimacy and ubiquity. First, by giving sonification the status it truly deserves as an equal partner in the triumvirate of human auditory communication. Next, by helping everyone learn the skills of active listening and develop an expectation that non-speech audio signals can be the bearers of important and useful information. And finally, by inlining sonifications as inscriptions in e-textbooks and online journals. So sonifications can function as full-fledged steps in a multi-step scientific argument. Once we've introduced sonic mappings into kindergarten and first grade, that's when we'll be raising the first generation of researchers who use sonification the same way they use charts and visual graphs. Effortlessly, transparently, unselfconsciously, without questioning the legitimacy of hearing or expecting a mystical, sublime experience every time they use sound as a tool for understanding. The sublime experience and sense of wonder comes from getting a sense of the processes underlying life and the universe. It doesn't matter whether that sense is vision or hearing. And as that generation reaches maturity, it's going to start shifting the way we think about science and mathematics and the universe. Because the text and vision-centric way we have been looking at the universe biases us to think in terms of equilibrium states, states that can be represented by pictures and text and mathematical equations that don't include a variable for time. But sound is inherently dynamic. Through sonification, we can hear the way things change as you transition from one state to another. So the first generation to learn mathematics and science through interactive sonification and animated graphs is also going to be more likely to conceive of the universe as dynamic processes rather than as static snapshots of that process. If we can manage to nudge things forward off of that unstable fixed point, then the next 25 years will be the era when sonification crosses over from its status as fascinating novelty to a universally utilized, legitimate tool for exploring, conveying, and yes, for discovering new knowledge and new ways of thinking through sound. That's the end of my slides, but I'm already looking forward to the 50th anniversary of ICAD, because I think the next 25 years are going to be the defining moment for sonification.